Final vote on the bill. I want to urge everyone to vote for this bill. This is a good bill. It cuts spending, it does the nation's business, and it's fair and transparent. And I urge the adoption of the bill and yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment by Mr. Whitfield of Kentucky, amendment by Mr. Fleming of Louisiana, amendment number 28 by Mr. Garamendi of California, amendment by Ms. Spear of California, amendment by Mr. Shabbat of Ohio. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Whitfield of Kentucky.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
Another series of amendment votes in day 2 of debate on energy and water project spending, leading up to a vote on final passage. A quick snapshot of the bill. The House legislation provides just over $30 billion, a 9% less than this year and 12% less than the President requested. The administration says the President will veto the bill if sent to him as is. Here's more about it from a reporter covering the debate. Ari Natter, energy reporter at BNA News. How's the House debate going on the energy and water spending bill?
It's definitely going. They're working their way through a lot of amendments, and they could be working late into tonight and maybe part of Thursday as well.
How much money is proposed in the bill, and how does it compare with past years?
Right. Well, this bill would appropriate about $30 billion, which is about $2 billion less than last year's version. What's interesting about it to me is the amount of money that would be appropriated to the Energy Department, which is about $3 billion less than last year's $25 billion, actually a little bit less than that. And this bill would dramatically cut funding for renewable and energy efficiency. So that's interesting, and it's kind of laying bare the priorities of Democrats and Republicans in this debate.
Talk a little bit more about that. Why does that interest you?
Well, Obama's issued a veto threat largely because of that reason. He says it underfunds, he said, critical investments in clean energy. There's also a veto threat because the bill would allow the Energy Department to proceed with Yucca Mountain, the nuclear waste repository that the Obama administration opposes. So you've seen a lot of Democratic amendments to try to increase the renewable funding, and so far they've pretty much all been defeated. There have been some Republican amendments passed, actually taking a little bit less away from those programs and transferring them to other areas.
As you mentioned, there's been a lot of talk about clean energy programs. What's that debate about?
Well, like I said, I think it kind of lays bare the priorities of Republicans and Democrats in the House. Generally speaking, Republicans are more in favor of fossil fuels, which they say are reliable, dependable, and producing electricity now, while Democrats say we need to invest in clean energy for the future and also to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
How does the House bill compare with the Senate's version?
The Senate's version is larger. It's about $4 billion larger than the House version, and also it increases funding for clean energy. There's about $5 million more for the Energy Department's main clean energy spending programs than what's currently funded in enacted levels. So that's pretty interesting, and that's a pretty big difference between the two bills. So that's something they're going to have to work out. The Senate bill may go to the floor later this month. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has said he wants to bring that bill to the floor by the end of this month.
You said that the bill is really opening up and letting us see what the priorities are for both the Democrats and the Republicans. How is the bill likely to fare on final passage?
I would be surprised if it failed. They have the votes to pass it, and my prediction is it'll pass along party lines.
Ari Natter is an energy reporter at BNA News. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
The amendment that the House is voting on now would prevent renewable energy funds from being used for wind energy programs. 4 more amendment votes after this one, a procedural vote, and then a vote on final passage of the energy and water spending bill. Also tonight, the House Rules Committee announced an emergency meeting this hour on part of the Farm Bill. This is the farm-only portion of the Farm Bill that failed in the House before the July 4th recess. The other part of the original Farm Bill not being considered deals with nutrition programs like food stamps. We'll have more on that later. Some news from today. The Hill reports that the Federal Aviation Administration announced that it would require pilots to have 1,500 hours of flight training before they could fly a commercial airplane. The new threshold is a huge jump from the 250 flight hours previously required and comes days after the crash of an Asiana Airlines flight in San Francisco that killed 2 people and injured more than 180. The experience of pilots has been a major focus of the crash since the airline revealed that the pilot of the jet was training to learn how to fly the Boeing 777. That from the Hill. During the rest of this vote, we'll get an update on the investigation of the crash from the NTSB.
Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Hersman. I'm the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm here to provide you with an update on our team's investigative work into the Asiana 214 crash that occurred here on Saturday night. I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce you to our investigator in charge, Mr. Bill English. He's leading our team of investigators. We have about 20 investigators who are out working, and he's coordinating that work and leading the investigation for our agency. I'm going to give you an update on what our team has been doing over the last 24 hours since I last spoke to you. Our operations group did conclude the 4 pilot interviews yesterday afternoon. I already briefed you on the 3 flying pilots and what they shared with our investigators. We do, in our investigations, look at pilots' 72-hour history, their work-rest history, to try to understand if they were fatigued, what conditions that they were working under, if there are any issues that could have affected their performance in flight. And so let me just give you a brief summary. We've got the 2 crew members who we talked about yesterday, and I'll just quickly go back over the crew that we talked about yesterday. The pilot in the left seat, we call him the flying pilot. He was undergoing his initial operating experience in the 777. He was an experienced pilot, had been flying other aircraft, had about 10,000 hours. He was halfway through his initial operating experience on this flight. The pilot in the right seat, we're calling him the instructor pilot. He's also a training captain. This was his first trip as a training captain in the 777. He also has a significant amount of experience, as well as 3,000 hours in the 777. The pilot that was in the jump seat, we're calling him the relief first officer. And the pilot that's seated in the cabin, we're calling him the relief captain. So just when we're talking about the crew, that's the terminology that we'll use for the purpose of this press briefing. We were interested in the work-rest history for the 2 pilots who were seated in the left and the right seat at the time of the accident. I'm going to share their 72-hour, or the history that we gained from talking with them yesterday. The flying pilot stated that on July 5th he was off duty at home. He had about 8 hours of sleep the night before, and then he went to the airport early to prepare for the flight. He wanted to make sure that he was prepared as he was going to be working with this instructor pilot for the first time as they were paired together for his initial operating experience. He briefed with the instructor pilot at 14:40, and this is in Seoul. He was in the cockpit a half an hour before he took command. The instructor pilot related he had about 8 hours of rest the night before. He spent the day relaxing with his family. He reported for duty at the airport around 2:20 p.m. And he worked, and again this crew is paired together. They worked about 4 hours and 15 minutes on the first leg of the flight, on the takeoff. And then they were off duty. The relief crew came in for about 5 hours. And then they returned to the cockpit for the last hour and a half of the flight. The first officer, the relief first officer, joined them when they got to about 10,000 feet. Our systems group has been out working. There are a number of avionics systems that have been harvested. We're very interested in making sure that we take a look at all of the equipment on the aircraft, and this is one part of what we'll be doing. There was an ELT, or an emergency locator transmitter, that had been going off since the crash. They did locate the ELT and they turned that off. It transmits a position beacon and a distress signal, so if folks are trying to locate an aircraft in a search and rescue operation, it makes it easier to find it. Obviously everyone knew that this aircraft was here. We just needed to get that ELT turned off because it was still transmitting. They're accessing some of the flight control actuators, and they retrieved the QAR, the quick access recorder, and have sent it back to our lab. The quick access recorder is often used to quickly download data from a flight. Operators use this data for evaluations of performance of the aircraft, of the crew, identifying any anomalies. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about automation. There have been a lot of questions about autopilot, auto throttles, and some of the auto flight regimes in the aircraft. And so I'm going to start kind of a little bit basic, and we're going to work down to a few more specifics. When we talk about auto flight, we're talking about tools that are available to pilots in the cockpit of airplanes. They can be simple or they can be sophisticated. And so in a pilot like, in an airplane like the 777, we have very sophisticated automation. But the pilots can hand fly or fly manually the airplane from takeoff through cruise flight for 10 hours to landing. They can do that without using any automation if they'd like. They can also use an extensive amount of automation. In fact, airplanes today are sophisticated enough that you can achieve an auto landing in 0-0 conditions. So you can have limited visibility, you can not be able to approach the airport under visual conditions, and the airplane can land itself. So you can do everything manually, you can look for a lot of automation, or you can do a combination of something in between. Automation can be very helpful to pilots. It can decrease their workload, and this is particularly important when they're in high workload environments. Automation can also help with things like efficiency. It can help be able to space aircraft more closely together so you can get more airplanes into a certain airspace or more takeoffs and landings at an airport. Automation can help achieve better fuel efficiency. Automation can help ensure that pilots don't bust altitude. It can help maintain a level of safety and efficiency in the cockpit. So when you look at automation, and I think a lot of people are familiar with autopilot, and most people probably think of autopilot as providing assistance in 2 axes, heading and altitude. That's a basic autopilot. But today's equipment in aircraft now is so much more sophisticated. And so when I'm going to talk about this, I want you all to recognize that there's a level of sophistication here. We're not going to get into a lot of detail, but for the layperson, when you think about automation, it can do a lot. It can assist the pilots. But there are 2 pilots in the cockpit for a reason. They're there to fly, to navigate, to communicate, and if they're using automation, a big key is to monitor. And pilots are trained to monitor. They have training in monitoring skills. And in fact, when they break up their duties in the cockpit, you will have 1 pilot in a two-person crew who's designated as the pilot flying, and the other pilot is designated as the pilot monitoring. So when we talk about autopilot, when we talk about auto thrust, there are things that the pilots do to activate these different modes or actions, and there are things that they can do for the pilots. There are computers in the cockpit, there are computers in the airplane. These computers talk to each other, they're interconnected, and so the pilots may choose to activate certain heading or speed or modes, and they do that by turning knobs and pushing buttons to make this happen. They set them where they want them, and they activate the selection that they want, and then the airplane figures out how to achieve what the pilot has commanded. So let's say an air traffic controller directs a pilot to head in a certain direction, gives them heading 030. They can actually select a heading, and the autopilot will take them in that heading. If the air traffic controller tells them that he wants them to maintain 180 knots, they can select that, and they select a mode to maintain 180 knots. When they do these things, sometimes they're doing something that's a single command, but sometimes it's going to need to draw from multiple systems, and so those systems can be coupled. Autopilot may very well be relying on auto throttles as well. Autopilot helps pilots with pitch, roll, attitude, and heading, and auto thrust helps them with power. So they're making inputs into the flight computers to get the results that they want. So let's talk about auto throttle. Auto throttle is about power. Auto throttle can provide to pilots speed. It can help them with descending, and it can help them with climbing. It's going to do different things. There are 5 discrete modes in auto throttle that you can see in flight. So when we talk about auto throttle, I'm going to give you a very simple example to help kind of explain how auto throttle works. And I would like to bring up another vehicle, a car. So if you use cruise control in a car, you can set the cruise control for 50 miles per hour. But if the cruise control allows the car's speed to increase to 55, 60, 70, 75, the driver needs to intervene by putting his foot on the brake or disconnecting the cruise control. When we talk about cruise control in a car, I want you to think about that like an old calculator that we used maybe 20 years ago. And then we're going to talk about auto throttle in a cockpit, and that's like an iPhone with GPS. It's much more sophisticated. It's not cruise control in a car. It's a different thing. But just understand that the pilot sets what he wants in different modes, but then there is a responsibility to monitor that he's getting what he asked for. So with this flight, in the last 2.5 minutes of the flight, from the data on our flight data recorder, we see multiple autopilot modes and we see multiple auto throttle modes. We need to understand what those modes were, if they were commanded by the pilots, if they were activated inadvertently, and if the pilots understood what the mode was doing. And so I know there's a lot of questions about auto throttle. We still need to look at the data that's on the FDR. We need to validate that data, and we need to work with the manufacturer, Boeing, to understand what the design and expectations of those automated modes are. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the runways and air traffic control. We've got a slide here of the airport, and I just want to bring this up just to share a bit with you about why certain sequencing is done coming into the airport. Airport efficiency is predicated on the ability to pair arrival aircraft on both runway 28 left and 28 right. And so you've got two parallel runways on 28 left and 28 right. Because they are so close together, you have got to space the aircraft out that are coming in on those parallel runways so they're not right next to each other. They have to be alternating so that they're coming in offset. So they're zippering in as they're landing. And so when I talk about some of these ATC directions, understand that they're being given directions so that those runways can be slotted appropriately. I'm going to talk about some ATC plots right now, some radar plots. This first one is an overview of a radar plot, and this is of the Asiana 214 flight. You can see the red or the blue targets, and these targets are sampled approximately every 5 seconds. And this data was provided by the Federal Aviation Administration to our staff. Slide 2. At 11:21, Asiana 214 reports the San Francisco airport in sight to the approach controller and is cleared for the visual approach to runway 28 left. From the point of where this landing clearance is issued, all altitude adjustments are at the discretion of the crew of Asiana 214. So the next slide shows that the pilot is issued a speed restriction of 180 knots until the 5-mile final approach, and is then instructed to contact the control tower. So this is a handoff between Sacramento, the Sacramento area, Northern California TRACON, to San Francisco Airport's control tower. So remember I mentioned to you the issuance of the speed restrictions is related to that slotting of airplanes coming in on 28 left and 28 right. So that's why they're asking them to maintain speed so they can properly space those other airplanes that are coming in. Now I'm just going to point something out to you. We're going to go to the next slide. Oh, you know what? We've moved too far ahead. Okay, on this slide, I just want to point out here, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that they're instructed to turn to 030 degrees and descend to 3,000 feet. This is the kind of thing that the pilots may use the automation in the cockpit to help them with. And so when they're instructed to turn to 030, they can enter that in, and the aircraft will calculate exactly what needs to happen in the turn to get them to that heading. Descending to 3,000 feet, the same way. And so just as they were asked to maintain 180 knots, again, that is something that the pilots can ask the computers to do for them. Or they can hand fly the plane, they can do it manually, they can achieve those marks on their own by hand flying the aircraft. So thanks, Kelly, for the next slide. And this is the you can see the two bridges here, and so I think for those of you who are local, you can see the Dumbarton and San Mateo bridges that they're going to cross over. At 11:26, Asiana 214 checked in on San Francisco tower frequency for final on runway 28 left. The local controller issued several instructions to other aircraft that were in various phases of departure from San Francisco or that had just arrived in San Francisco and did not immediately respond to Asiana 214. At 11:26:56, Asiana 214 again contacted the air traffic control tower and initiated communication with the local controller. The local controller then acknowledged Asiana. Subsequent contact and a landing clearance was issued. The landing clearance was issued, and I think, Kelly, is this the last one? We've got one more. The landing clearance was issued when the airplane was about 1.5 miles from the threshold. And I know that you all will have questions. It's not unusual for an air traffic controller to not immediately respond. If they are busy and if they're in a heavy workload period. The second contact, the controller responded. And so we're providing you some information about the last radar plots that we have. I'm going to talk to you now about survival factors. When we look at the aircraft, there's a business class and what Asiana refers to as a travel class, or what we might call here in the U.S. an economy class on the aircraft. The business class has a seating configuration of 1 at the window, 2, and 1. The traveler class has a configuration of 3, 3, and 3 across. So I'm talking to you about the seat spacing in each of those cabins. I had a question yesterday about seat belts, and our investigators have advised that the seat belts in business class are lap shoulder belts, and the seat belts in the travel class are lap only. We've talked about the aircraft doors and slides. There are 8 exit doors on the aircraft, 4 on the left and 4 on the right. And we've marked them here. I'm going to refer to the doors by each of these numbers and letters. And so it's 1 left, 1 right, 2 left, 2 right, and so on. There were 12 flight attendants on board the aircraft. Our team interviewed 6 of them yesterday, and the other 6 remained hospitalized and they were not interviewed. Of the flight attendants that we interviewed, there were 2 flight attendants at the 1L door, one of whom was called the cabin manager, or we'd call them the purser, the lead flight attendant. Both of those crew members were interviewed by our team, and these crew members, I'm going to talk about in a little bit, were the ones that engaged with the flight crew about evacuation, the flight attendants at 1L. There were 2 flight attendants seated at 2L, one of whom is also qualified as a cabin manager, but was not acting in that capacity on this flight. But he seemed to be, in a sense, the lead flight attendant in the traveler class. There was one flight attendant at 3L, and that flight attendant was interviewed, and the two flight attendants at 2L were also interviewed. There was one flight attendant at 1R. That flight attendant is hospitalized, and she was pinned by one of the evacuation slides that deployed inside of the aircraft. There is one flight attendant at the 2R door. She was also pinned by one of the evacuation slides that deployed inside of the aircraft. She was hospitalized. She broke a bone in her lower leg. She's been released, and she was interviewed by our investigators. There was one flight attendant at 3R, and that flight attendant was hospitalized. And there are 4 flight attendants in the aft portion of the cabin near doors 4L and 4R. 3 of those flight attendants and their seats were ejected from the aircraft. One of the flight attendants in the rear, in the aft cabin, was found inside the aircraft with the seat. All 4 of those flight attendants are hospitalized, and they were not interviewed. All of the passenger seating remained on the aircraft. None of the passenger seats were ejected from the aircraft. So I mentioned that the escape doors inflated inside the aircraft at 1R and 2R, and they pinned the flight attendants. Those flight attendants needed assistance to get out from underneath those slides. They couldn't do it alone. The evacuation slide normally inflates when it's in the armed position and the door is opened. It is unknown at this time why the slides inflated inside the aircraft during the accident sequence. The manufacturer of the slide...
329, the amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. Clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Fleming of Louisiana.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a requested for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
A 2-minute vote on an amendment that would eliminate funding for a clean energy loan guarantee program created in the 2009 stimulus bill. As we mentioned, the House Rules Committee has set a meeting this hour on part of the Farm Bill. The Hill writes that House GOP leaders are moving to set up a Thursday morning vote. The story goes on to say, after a day of furious whipping, leaders now believe they can pass the measure over the opposition of farm groups and some conservative organizations. The House Rules Committee is considering the Farm Bill without the food stamp funding, with the funding removed. The Hill story goes on to say, as a sweetener to conservatives, the bill would repeal the underlying 1938 and 1949 farm laws and replace it with the 2013 version. Doing this would remove the threat of the Farm Bill expiring every 5 years, a deadline that has allowed Congress to expand farm subsidies in the past.
On this vote, the yeas are 228. The nays... We're open.
Mrs. Davis of California.
No.
Mrs. Davis of California votes no. Mr. Marchant.
Got one more.
Mr. Marchant votes aye.
Hold on. We got one.
Mr. David Scott. Mr. David Scott votes no. Mrs. Capito. Off no on aye for Mrs. Capito.
We are closed. On this vote, the yeas are 230, the nays are 194. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 28, printed in the congressional record, offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 28, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic devices. Will be a 2-minute vote.
Two more amendment votes after this one, a procedural vote, and then a vote on final passage of the energy and water spending bill. On the other side of the Capitol, the Senate has gone out for the night and returns tomorrow to resume debate on measures aimed at addressing the doubling of student loan interest rates. The Senate failed to cut off debate today on a Democratic measure proposing to extend the previous 3.4% student loan interest rate for a year. Republicans and Democrats, such as West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, are still working on a compromise bill that could attract enough support to advance. One option being considered is whether and how to include a cap on market-based interest rates to protect borrowers.
This vote, the yeas are 170, the nays are 253. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, on which further proceedings were postponed and in which the noes were prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Spear of California.
Recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. The sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is recorded. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This amendment would eliminate the funding for several regional commissions, including the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Delta Regional Authority. The Hill writes the two prominent Senate Democrats are pushing President Obama to put an end to large-scale force-feeding of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. In a letter to the President, a Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin and Intelligence Committee Chairwoman Dianne Feinstein said the President should direct the Pentagon to stop force feedings in all cases where it's not medically necessary to save the detainee's life. In those cases, the senators wrote, Guantanamo should follow U.S. federal prison guidelines and oversight procedures, some of which are currently being ignored. We expect this to be the last amendment vote of the night. Up next, up to 10 minutes of debate, a procedural vote, and then a vote on final passage.
The amendment is not adopted. The clerk will read.
This act may be cited as the Energy and Water Development and Related Agencies Appropriation Act 2014.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee now to rise and report the bill back to the House with sundry amendments and with the recommendation that amendments be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
Question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
And you are going to go over there.
Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House of the Senate of the Union have had under consideration H.R. 2609, directs me to report the same back to the House with sundry amendments with the recommendation that the amendments be agreed to and the bill as amended to pass.
Without objection. The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 2609 and reports the bill back to the House with sundry amendments adopted in the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation that the amendments be adopted and the bill be amended as passed, and that the bill as amended do pass. Under House Resolution 288, the previous question is ordered. Is a separate vote demanded on any amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the Chair will put them in gross. The question is on the adoption of the amendments. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The amendments are adopted. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill making appropriations for energy and water development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes.
House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am opposed.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion?
Mr. Schneider of Illinois moves to recommit the bill H.R. 2609 to the Committee on Appropriations with
Unanimous consent to suspend reading of the motion.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the time. This is the final amendment to the bill, which will not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. I rise to offer this motion to recommit to ensure, first, that the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River are protected from the continued threat of invasive species, including and particularly taking practical steps to address the threat of Asian carp to our fishing, tourism, and navigation on our nation's inland waterways. Second, that we provide the resources necessary to combat invasive aquatic plant growths that threaten our national fisheries, wildlife, and communities. And third, that we continue to fund efforts for our coastal communities to help them fully recover from natural disasters, while at the same time proactively prioritizing efforts being made to mitigate future threats to human life and property. Madam Speaker, the underlying bill represents an historic divestment in American infrastructure, jobs, and energy research. Instead of prioritizing investments that will safeguard our communities and improve our nation's navigable waterways, this bill overemphasizes several outdated defense budget expenditures at the expense of making meaningful, forward-looking investments to grow our economy and contribute positively to our environment. We must not use the guise of fiscal prudence as an excuse to block important investments in alternative energy and basic physical energy research, which benefits all sectors of our economy, or to block important investments in infrastructure projects to improve our inland waterways and mitigate the potentially devastating consequences of natural disasters, or to block investment in weatherization assistance to help our most vulnerable populations. This bill constitutes a generational abandonment of our communities and children who will have to face the stark reality of the decisions made here today, including a significant rollback of the Clean Water Act. The proposed amendment does not address all of the concerns I have with the underlying bill, but it will at least help to improve the bill moving forward. Specifically, Asian carp continue to deplete fish stocks and degrade local ecological balance and must be addressed by a holistic government approach that partners with states to utilize best practices. This amendment would encourage these partnerships with the states while providing funding that can meaningfully address and prevent the outbreak of invasive species. Similarly, the influx of pollution and runoff to our waterways has contributed to an overabundance of aquatic plant life, such as algae blooms in Lake Erie, that choke vital nutrients from our natural ecosystems. This amendment takes a more practical approach to limiting the causes of this overgrowth, improving our water quality. The underlying bill also fails to adequately address the continuing needs of coastal communities adversely affected by flooding and other natural disasters. This amendment would aid in addressing critical vulnerabilities of communities facing severe economic impact from flooding while prioritizing projects that will help safeguard human life. Lastly, but very significantly, this amendment would strengthen the current cooperative energy research being performed between the United States and the State of Israel. For almost 2 decades, we have partnered with Israel in developing scientific, business, and research relationships that contribute positively to the energy sectors of both the U.S. and Israel. This amendment continues that long partnership and capitalizes on our joint research capacities to identify emerging technologies and best practices for manufacturing while efficiently utilizing taxpayer money to continue to strategically benefit both our nations. Mr. Speaker, the essential provisions of this amendment will only improve the underlying bill, contributing significantly to American job growth, the safety of our communities, and protecting our vital natural resources. I strongly urge my colleagues to support these common sense changes. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Madam Chair, I rise in opposition to the motion to recommit.
Gentleman's recognized
The
for
House
5
has
minutes.
worked its will over the past 2 days, and all in all, dozens of amendments have been considered in a very open and amicable process. This bill strengthens national security, fosters a stronger economy, and maintains important infrastructure that keeps America open for business and promotes job opportunities. And we do all of this while making some tough but smart funding decisions, saving taxpayers $2.9 billion over last year's enacted level. We have just 2.5 months left before the end of the year. This is the time to act. Now is the time to pass our government funding bills. I urge my colleagues to vote against the motion to recommit and to support the bill. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. No. The noes have it. The motion
I
is
ask
not.
for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by a 5-minute vote on passage of the bill and approval of the journal if ordered. It's a 5-minute vote.
This is the last chance to change the energy and water spending bill before a vote on final passage. This motion would make several changes, including increasing the flood control and coastal emergencies account by $7 million, which is intended to deal with upcoming hurricanes. Up next, a vote on final passage. House Republicans met today to talk about how to handle immigration legislation. Here's how the Associated Press writes about it. Divided on immigration, House Republicans bluntly challenged President Obama's willingness to secure the nation's borders on Wednesday and appeared unimpressed by George W. Bush's advice to carry a, quote, benevolent spirit into a debate that includes a possible path to citizenship for millions. We covered former President Bush today at a naturalization ceremony at his presidential library in Dallas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to Freedom Hall. I am incredibly grateful to be able to witness this joyous and uplifting ceremony. It will be inspiring to see people of different ages and different countries raise their right hands and take the oath to become citizens of the United States. All who swear the oath of citizenship are doing more than completing a legal process. You're making a lifetime pledge to support the values and laws of America. The pledge comes with great privileges. It also comes with great responsibilities. For some of you, the day comes after a long and difficult journey. For all of you, this is a defining moment in your lives. America is your country. It is more than a home. I welcome you to this free nation. I congratulate you and your families, and it's an honor to call you fellow Americans. Our immigrant heritage has enriched America's history. It continues to shape our society. Each generation of Americans, of immigrants, brings a renewal to our national character and adds vitality to our culture. Newcomers have a special way of appreciating the opportunities of America, and when they seize those opportunities, our whole nation benefits. In the 1790s, an immigrant from Ireland designed the White House. I'm familiar with the place. He did a fine job. He also helped build the Capitol. In the 1990s, 200 years later, an immigrant from Russia helped create the internet search engine Google. In between, new citizens have made contributions in virtually every professional field, and millions of newcomers have strengthened their communities through their hard work, through their love of family, and through their faith. We're a nation of immigrants, and we must uphold that tradition, which has strengthened our country in so many ways. We're also a nation of laws, and we must enforce our laws. America can be a lawful society and a welcoming society at the same time. We can uphold our traditions of assimilating immigrants and honoring our heritage of a nation built on the rule of law. But we have a problem. The laws governing the immigration system aren't working. The system is broken. We're now in an important debate on reforming those laws, and that's good. I don't intend to get involved in the politics or the specifics of policy, but I do hope there is a positive resolution to the debate. And I hope during the debate that we keep a benevolent spirit in mind and that we understand the contributions immigrants make to our country. We must remember that the vast majority of immigrants are decent people who work hard and support their families and practice their faith and lead responsible lives. Some willingly defend the flag, including 2 who are about to take the oath here today. At its core, immigration is a sign of a confident and successful nation. It says something about our country that people all around the world are willing to leave their homes and leave their families and risk everything to come to our country. Their talent and hard work and love of freedom have helped us become the leader of the world. Our generation must ensure that America remains a beacon of liberty and the most hopeful society the world has ever known. We must always be proud to welcome people as fellow Americans. Our new immigrants are just what they've always been.
Adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Under Clause 10 of Rule 20, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
Members voting now